A veteran ranger in Alaska thought he'd seen everything. Storms, avalanches, bears bigger than trucks. But nothing prepared him for what he found deep in the Wrangell Mountains after a thunderous boom shook the valley. First came the silence, then the massive tracks pressed deep into the moss. And when he followed them, he says he found something no ranger is trained to face. A giant figure sprawled in the brush, unmoving, more human than animal. By the time help arrived, the body was gone, dragged into the timber, leaving only crushed branches and a stench that burned their eyes. Officials dismissed it as a scavenged bear, but the ranger's private log tells a different story. If the legend was lying dead in front of him that night, who or what took it away before daylight? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light, and yours is one of them. I've served as a backcountry ranger in Wrangell St. Elias National Park for 15 years now, and August of 1998 stands out as the month everything changed. The park's 13.2 million acres of Alaskan wilderness have always held their secrets, but what began that late summer still haunts me. My name is Thomas Arnett. Most just call me Ranger Arnett, and I've earned my reputation for keeping a level head in tough situations. Search and rescue operations, bear encounters, lost hikers. I've handled them all with the same methodical approach that comes from years of experience. But the events I'm about to relate tested everything I thought I knew about these mountains. It started with the booms, deep resonating sounds that echoed through the valleys, unlike anything I'd documented before, not quite like avalanches, which I'd heard plenty of times, and definitely not like the occasional sonic booms from military aircraft. These were different, more deliberate, almost rhythmic at times. The first reports came from seasonal rangers doing trail maintenance in the Crystalline Hills area. I initially dismissed them as typical backcountry sounds amplified by the terrain's natural acoustics. But then the pattern emerged. The booms would occur in series of 3 or 4, always in the early morning hours just before dawn, and always from the same general direction, deep in the park's northern sector where we rarely patrolled. Our park supervisor was getting concerned calls from the few remaining seasonal campers, and even some of our more experienced trail crew members were trading theories around the evening campfires. Could be mining activity, suggested one of the seasonal rangers during our morning briefing. Maybe some illegal operations up in those old claims? I knew better. We monitored all active claims, and that area had been dormant for decades. Besides, the sound signature was all wrong for explosives or heavy machinery. The park supervisor called me into his office in mid-August. He sat behind his desk, clipboard in hand, reviewing my recent patrol logs with that bureaucratic precision I'd come to expect. "Arnett, these reports are starting to attract attention," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "The last thing we need is some media circus about mysterious booms bringing thrill seekers into dangerous terrain." I understood his concern. With winter approaching, the weather was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Just that morning, I'd watched storm clouds gathering over the Wrangell Mountains, a reminder that our seasonal window was closing. "I'll increase patrols in the northern sector," I offered. "Map out the locations where the sounds are most frequently reported and see if I can identify a source." He nodded, though I caught that slight hesitation in his expression. "Just keep your reports factual. We don't need speculation fueling rumors." What he didn't say, but I knew he was thinking, was that rangers chasing mysterious sounds could damage the park's credibility. We were federal employees, after all, expected to provide rational explanations for natural phenomena. I spent the next week pushing deeper into the backcountry, my 35mm camera and field notebook always ready. The terrain grew, more challenging as I ventured into areas that rarely saw human traffic. The established trails gave way to game paths, and then to nothing at all. I marked my routes carefully on topographical maps, noting potential hazards and unusual features. My standard gear included everything I'd learned to trust over the years: my .357 Magnum sidearm for bear defense, detailed maps, two-way radio, though reception was spotty at best, and a full camping kit. The weight was familiar, almost comfortable, as I worked my way through the vast landscape. The seasonal rangers' radio chatter grew more nervous as the days passed. They'd hear the booms while checking trail conditions or maintaining campsites, and their reports started showing signs of strain. Nervous laughter would ripple through the morning meetings, and I'd catch them whispering when I walked by with my field notes. Ranger Arnett, one of the younger crew members, caught me after a briefing. We heard them again last night. 3 distinct booms, maybe 10 minutes apart, sounded closer than before. I recorded every report meticulously, triangulating positions and times. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the explanation remained elusive. The sounds seemed to be moving, following no logical path that would suggest human activity or known natural phenomena. The park supervisor maintained his skeptical stance, but I noticed him spending more time reviewing old incident logs from the 1970s. Once, I glimpsed him studying a yellowed report with unusual intensity, though he quickly filed it away when he noticed me watching. As August drew to a close, the crowds thinned even further. The weather turned increasingly volatile, with sudden squalls sweeping down from the mountains without warning. It was during one of these breaks in the weather that I made the decision to establish a base camp deeper in the northern sector than any ranger had patrolled that season. The park supervisor approved my extended patrol with obvious reluctance, making me promise to maintain regular radio contact, when possible. I packed additional supplies, knowing I might be out there for several days. The seasonal rangers watched me prepare with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They had their theories about the sounds, whispered stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling, but I kept my focus on the facts, on what could be documented and verified. I pulled out my topographical maps and spread them across my desk in the ranger station, the familiar contour lines offering some comfort as I planned my route. The northern sector was vast and largely untouched, exactly the kind of place where unusual sounds could echo for miles without clear explanation. I'd need at least 3 days to properly investigate the area where most reports originated. My field notebook was already filling up with preliminary notes. Date: August 24th, 1998. Weather forecast showed a high-pressure system moving in, promising clear skies but dropping temperatures at night. Perfect conditions for sound to travel. I made careful notations of the reported boom locations, triangulating them based on witness statements. Remember to check in every 4 hours, Sarah at dispatch reminded me as I performed my radio tests. We've got spotty coverage up there, but Channel 3 usually cuts through. I acknowledged with a crisp, copy that, and logged the check-in schedule in my notebook. 15 years of service had taught me never to take communications for granted. My gear was meticulously organized. 35mm camera with extra film, my trusty .357 Magnum for bear defense, emergency flares, first aid kit, and enough supplies for 5 days. Always pack for longer than planned. Another lesson from experience. I double-checked my compass and backup GPS unit, though I trusted the former more in these mountains. While I was loading my pack at the trailhead, an old-timer pulled up in a battered pickup. I recognized him as one of the local prospectors who kept to himself most of the year. He stood at the edge of the gravel lot, watching me with that particular look I'd come to know from long-term residents. Part wariness, part knowing. "Heading up to check them noises?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes. His oilskin jacket had seen better days, and the rifle slung over his shoulder looked as weathered as he did. "That's right," I replied, adjusting my pack straps. "Any thoughts? On what might be causing them?" He was quiet for a long moment, scratching at his grey beard. "Them's giant men up there," he finally said, voice low and measured. "Been here longer than any of us. Best to leave 'em be." I'd heard similar stories before. Every remote area had its legends. But something in his tone made me pause. Giant men? I kept my voice neutral, professional, taller than any man you ever seen. Make them sounds to talk to each other across the valleys. He shifted uncomfortably. "Fish and game, they don't want to hear about it. Neither does your park service, I expect." I pulled out my notebook, more to have something to do with my hands than to actually write anything down. "Have you seen these giant men yourself?" "Seen enough to stay clear of that north country," he replied, already turning back to his truck. "You be careful up there, Ranger. Some things ain't meant for reports. Meant for reports." I watched him drive away, gravel crunching under his tires. In my notebook, I wrote, "Local resident reports folklore of giant men, possible connection to indigenous legends." Below that, I added more practical theories. Potential causes. Avalanche activity, though unseasonable. Military operations. Check with Eielson AFB. Natural gas venting. The morning sun was climbing higher as I shouldered my pack and checked my map one final time. My planned route would take me up through the crystalline hills, then north into more isolated terrain. I'd marked potential camping spots near water sources, with alternatives in case I needed to change course. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Arnett." I spoke into my radio. "Beginning patrol into northern sector. First check-in scheduled for 1300 hours. "Copy that, Ranger Arnett." Sarah's voice crackled back. "Stay safe up there." As I started up the trail, I found myself thinking about the prospector's words. In 15 years, I'd filed hundreds of reports. Everything from bear encounters to lost hikers to illegal mining operations. I prided myself on thorough, objective documentation. But something about this assignment felt different. The booms had been reported by reliable sources, including my own rangers. They needed explanation. I made a final note in my log before stowing it. Objective. Locate and document source of reported seismic activity in northern sector. Maintain radio contact. Gather photographic evidence where possible. Expected return, August 27th, 1998. The trail ahead wound through stands of spruce and hemlock, still heavy with morning dew. Behind me, the ranger station disappeared into the trees, and ahead lay miles of wilderness that saw maybe a dozen human visitors in a good year. I adjusted my pack once more and started walking, my boots crunching on the gravel trail. Whatever was causing those sounds, I was determined to find a rational explanation. Something I could put in a report that wouldn't raise eyebrows back at headquarters. But the prospector's words about giant men kept coming back to me, mixing uncomfortably with all the strange stories I'd heard over the years, but never included in official documentation. Stories that didn't fit neatly into incident reports or patrol logs. Stories that, like the booms themselves, echoed in ways that were hard to explain. The morning started like any other patrol. I shouldered my pack at 0600 hours, double-checking my radio's connection to base. The late August air had that crisp edge to it, warning of the approaching autumn. My boots found easy purchase on the familiar trail as I headed north, following the route I'd marked on my maps the night before. The first few hours were textbook wilderness patrol. I logged the usual signs of wildlife: fresh bear scat near mile marker 8, moose tracks crossing the stream bed at the valley junction, and the occasional eagle soaring overhead. The sun climbed steadily, burning off the morning fog that clung to the valleys. I maintained a steady pace, stopping every 2 hours to radio my coordinates back to base and take water. Around 1300 hours, I reached the first area where the mysterious booms had been reported. The terrain opened into a wide valley, bordered by steep ridges that could easily bounce sound in unpredictable ways. I paused to eat my lunch, making notes about the topography and possible acoustic patterns that might explain the phenomena. That's when I first noticed something was off. The change came gradually at first, so subtle that I might have missed it if I hadn't spent 23 years reading these mountains. The wind, which had been a constant companion all morning, died completely. Not the usual temporary lull between gusts, but a total absence that felt wrong in my bones. The aspens that had been rustling all morning stood frozen, their leaves unnaturally still. Then the birds went quiet. I've experienced sudden wildlife silence before. It usually means a predator is moving through the area, but this was different. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I found myself straining to hear anything: insects, wind, the distant creek. But there was nothing. Just a thick blanket of silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood slowly, my hand instinctively checking my sidearm. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, though I couldn't explain why. Years of experience had taught me to trust these instincts, even when they made no logical sense. I scanned the tree line methodically, looking for any movement, any sign of what might have caused this unnatural quiet. That's when I spotted the depression in the moss about 30 yards ahead. Following proper protocol, I approached carefully, photographing the area before getting too close. The impression was clear and deep in the thick moss, much deeper than my own boot prints nearby. I pulled out my measuring tape and documented everything methodically, trying to maintain professional detachment even as my pulse quickened. The print, if that's what it was, measured 16 inches from heel to toe. The depth and clarity suggested something of considerable weight had passed through recently, when the ground was still damp from morning dew. What struck me most was the anatomical detail: 5 distinct toe impressions, a clear arch, and a heel pad that seemed almost human in its structure, but scaled up to impossible proportions. I found 3 more similar impressions, forming a clear line heading northeast. The stride length between them was nearly 8 feet, far beyond human capability. Each print was pressed deep into the moss, suggesting whatever made them carried significant weight. My scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations. This far north, permafrost melt could create strange ground distortions. Bears sometimes leave unusual tracks when their hind paws overlap their front prints. The moss itself could have grown irregularly due to underlying terrain features. I photographed everything from multiple angles, placed my radio next to one print for scale, and made detailed sketches in my notebook. The rational part of my brain kept pushing toward natural explanations, but 23 years of wilderness experience was telling me something else entirely, something that aligned uncomfortably well with those local stories about giant men in the valleys. I spent nearly an hour documenting the site, grateful for the familiar routine of measurement and notation. It helped keep my mind focused on procedure rather than speculation. In my official log, I wrote, "Observed unusual ground impressions, possibly caused by permafrost distortion or overlapping bear tracks. Further investigation needed. Will return with plaster casting materials for documentation." The silence had lifted gradually while I worked, the normal sounds of the wilderness returning so slowly I barely noticed the transition. By the time I finished my documentation, birds were calling again, and the wind had picked up, rustling through the aspens like nothing had ever happened. But the impressions remained, deep and undeniable in the moss, challenging every rational explanation. I tried to impose on them. I marked the location on my GPS and took a final set of photos before continuing my patrol. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of these mountains. I'd come looking for an explanation for mysterious sounds, and instead found something that raised far more questions than answers. I made camp as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, choosing a relatively flat stretch of ground near one of the braided channels of the river. The location gave me good visibility in all directions, while keeping me close to water. Following protocol, I radioed my coordinates to base and received confirmation just before the mountains would block clear transmission. The evening routine was second nature after 15 years of backcountry work. I secured my food in a bare canister 50 yards from my tent, set up my sleeping gear, and prepared a simple meal of dehydrated stew on my portable stove. The rushing water provided a constant background noise that usually helped me relax after a long day of hiking. But something felt off tonight. As I sat finishing my dinner, I caught whiffs of an unfamiliar odor on the intermittent breeze. At first, I dismissed it as typical wilderness smells, maybe a dead animal upstream, or a bear's marking. But this was different. The scent was musky, almost primate-like, reminding me of the times I'd visited larger zoos. Yet it wasn't quite that either. I've encountered pretty much every large animal in these mountains, And this smell matched none of them. Not moose, not bear, not caribou. I made detailed notes in my field journal, knowing how unreliable memory can be. The smell would come and go with the wind, making it difficult to pinpoint its direction. As darkness settled in, I found myself growing more alert rather than tired. Years of experience had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, even if I couldn't immediately identify why. The first crack came at approximately 2200 hours. I was inside my tent, reviewing my maps by headlamp when I heard it. A sharp, wooden impact that echoed across the valley. It sounded like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree, but with more force than any human could muster. The sound reverberated off the mountain walls, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. I switched off my headlamp and listened intently. 30 seconds later, 2 more strikes followed in quick succession. These weren't random. They had a deliberate rhythm to them. 1, 2, 3. The sequence was too precise to be falling trees or storm debris. I unzipped my tent slowly, careful to make minimal noise. The quarter moon provided just enough light to make out the basic shapes of the landscape. As I stood there scanning the darkness, 2 answering strikes came from what seemed like the opposite side of the valley. These had the same wooden quality, but a slightly different tone, as if made by a different instrument. The timing was what got to me. Those 2 response strikes. They weren't random. They came exactly like an answer, like a conversation. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Perhaps waterlogged trees shifting in the wind or ice movements in the glacier 12 miles up valley. But neither explanation fit what I was hearing. The rhythm was too intentional, too controlled. I retrieved my notebook and wrote down the exact times and sequence, trying to maintain the professional detachment that had served me well over the years. But my hand wasn't quite as steady as usual. In 15 years of ranger work, I'd never heard anything quite like this. The knocks didn't repeat that night, but I remained awake far longer than I should have, straining to hear any further communications, because that's what they felt, like communications. The musky odor persisted intermittently until around midnight, when a slight shift in wind direction seemed to carry it away. I kept my sidearm close that night, though I told myself it was just standard procedure. The wilderness has a way of playing tricks on your senses, especially when you're alone. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something intelligent had orchestrated those knocks, something that wasn't listed in any of our wildlife guides. In my field log for that night, I wrote only the observable facts. Unknown animal scent detected at approximately 2000 hours, series of wood knocks at 2200 hours. 3 in sequence from the north, 2 in response from the south, possible natural explanations. Storm debris, glacier movement, falling trees. But I knew those explanations felt hollow, even as I wrote them down. The next morning, I would need to decide whether to continue deeper into the valley, following my original patrol route, or turn back with what information I had. The unexplained booms that had prompted this patrol suddenly seemed more significant in light of these wood knocks. Were they connected? The locals' whispered stories about giant men in these valleys crept back into my thoughts, though I tried to push them aside. A ranger's report needs to stick to facts, not folklore. But sometimes the line between the two gets awful thin out, here in the deep backcountry. The morning sun had barely crested the ridgeline when I broke camp, my mind still dwelling on those rhythmic knocks from the night before. I'd slept fitfully, waking at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. The musk lingered in my nostrils, neither dissipating nor growing stronger, just present enough to keep me on edge. I radioed in my morning check at 0700 hours, reporting my position and planned route for the day. The static filled. Response from dispatch confirmed receipt, though the connection was weaker than I'd like. These valleys could be tricky for radio signals, especially with the weather systems that rolled through. My patrol route took me northeast along the braided river, following game trails where possible. The morning remained cool, typical for late summer in the Wrangles, with high clouds threatening rain by afternoon. I kept my field notebook handy, documenting tracks and signs as protocol demanded. 15 years of ranger work had taught me the value of thorough documentation, even when nothing seemed amiss. Around 1100 hours, the terrain opened into a natural clearing, maybe 75 yards across. I stopped dead in my tracks. There, arranged in a rough semicircle near the tree line, stood 3 structures that had no business being there. These weren't the typical debris piles you might find in wilderness areas. No random tangles of fallen timber or wind-scattered branches. These were deliberate constructions, crude arches made from young birch and willow trees, bent and woven together with obvious purpose. The largest stood perhaps 9 feet tall, the others slightly smaller, but similar in design. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively resting on my .357. The construction was fresh. That much was immediately clear. Strips of bark had been peeled away recently enough that the exposed wood still showed raw and light-coloured. Several branches appeared to have been broken rather than cut, with splintered ends that suggested considerable strength had been applied. "This is Ranger Arnett," I spoke into my radio, more for the comfort of hearing a human voice than any real need to report. "I'm documenting some unusual structures at—" I checked my map and rattled off the coordinates. "Only static," answered. Pulled out my 35mm camera and began methodically photographing the structures. First, wide shots showing their arrangement and scale, using my pack for size reference. Then closer details, the weaving patterns, the fresh breaks, the stripped bark. My hands remained steady, training kicking in, but my mind raced through possibilities. No hiker would take the time or effort to build these, especially not in such a remote location. The nearest marked trail was 8 miles back, and this wasn't exactly a natural rest stop. The construction itself bothered me most. The branches weren't just propped together, they were actively woven and twisted, requiring significant manual dexterity. Yet there were no tool marks, no cuts that suggested human implements. I found myself speaking into my field recorder, keeping my voice professional despite the unease growing in my gut. Structures appear deliberately placed, oriented roughly, east to west. Construction is recent, estimated within the last 24 to 48 hours based on vegetation condition. No footprints or conventional tool marks visible. Branches show evidence of manual manipulation and weaving, with considerable force applied to achieve breaks rather than cuts. The morning silence returned as I worked, that same heavy quiet from yesterday. No bird calls, no wind in the trees, just the soft click of my camera shutter and the scratch of my pen in the notebook. The air felt thick, watchful. I found myself turning frequently, scanning the tree line, though I couldn't have said exactly what for. I took samples of the stripped bark and photographed several of the cleaner breaks in the wood. These would help establish a timeline, though I already knew what the lab would say. Too clean for weather damage, too crude for human tools. The implications of that middle ground made my scalp prickle. A light rain began to fall as I finished. My documentation. I carefully packed away my camera and samples, double-checking that everything was properly labelled and secured. The structures loomed behind me, their shadows somehow longer than they should have been in the diffuse light. I'd seen plenty of strange things in my years of service, weather phenomena, animal behaviour, geological oddities. But this felt different. This felt intentional. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Arnett, dispatch. Come, in for afternoon check." I keyed the mic, relieved at the human contact. "Arnett here. I'm heading west from my current position. Will forward full documentation of some unusual structures upon return to station. Over. Copy that. Be advised we're tracking a weather system moving your way. Over. Understood. I'll make camp early if needed. Arnett out." I took one last look at the arches before leaving the clearing. In the strengthening rain, they seemed to bend and shift, as if adjusting their pose for some unseen audience. I marked the location precisely on my map, though I had a feeling I wouldn't need coordinates to remember this spot. The rain began to fall more steadily as I moved on, following my planned route west. But every few minutes, I found myself looking back over my shoulder, unable to shake the sensation that I'd just documented something that challenged every rational explanation I'd been trained to provide. I made camp just before dusk, finding a relatively sheltered spot beneath a rock outcropping. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, and I was grateful for the natural overhang as I set up my tent. My evening radio check came through clearly enough, though static still crackled, through dispatcher's weather update. More rain expected through the night, they said. Nothing unusual for the Wrangles this time of year. I heated my dinner, freeze-dried beef stew, and reviewed my notes from the day, particularly the details about those strange structures. The sketches I'd made looked almost childish on paper, failing to capture their unsettling presence. Even now, miles away, I could picture them perfectly. Those crude arches, bare wood gleaming where bark had been stripped away. Sleep came fitfully. The rain drummed against my tent fly, and somewhere in the darkness, I could still catch whiffs of that peculiar musk from the previous night. I dozed off sometime after 2,300 hours, my service revolver within easy reach. The boom hit at 02:15. I know because I checked my watch the instant I jolted awake. The sound was unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of backcountry work. Not thunder, which rolls and rumbles, and not avalanche, which has a distinctive rushing quality. This was sharp, focused, and so powerful it made the ground beneath my sleeping pad vibrate. Before the echo could fade, rocks began clattering down the ridgeline above my camp. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, barely taking time to shove my feet into boots before bursting out of the tent. My flashlight beam caught fragments of stone, bouncing off the cliff face, some landing uncomfortably close to my position. For the first time since starting this patrol, raw fear overrode my professional detachment. Everything I'd encountered, the tracks, the knocks, those deliberate structures, suddenly felt connected to this moment. Protocol dictated I should document the event, take samples of the displaced rocks, photograph any fresh scarring on the cliff face. Instead, I found myself calculating the shortest route back to the ranger station. But as my pulse slowly steadied, duty reasserted itself. Whatever was happening here needed to be properly investigated and reported. I couldn't return with only half answers and blurry photographs. One more day, I told myself. One more day to gather concrete evidence, to find a rational explanation for these events. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in my tent, listening to the rain and the occasional patter of smaller rocks still working loose from above. My flashlight remained on, and my hand never strayed far from my revolver. As dawn broke, I forced myself to follow the direction of that thunderous sound from the night before. My ranger training kicked in despite my exhaustion, and I began a methodical sweep of the area, moving upslope through patches of morning mist that clung to the valley floor. About half a mile from my camp, I came across a disturbing sight. A wide swath of alderbrush had been completely decimated, not by natural causes, but by some tremendous force. Branches lay splintered and scattered across the slope, their leaves still green and fresh. This wasn't storm damage or normal wildlife activity. The destruction appeared recent and concentrated. My eyes followed the trail of broken vegetation up the incline, and that's when I saw it. At first, my tired brain processed what I was seeing as a poached moose. We occasionally dealt with illegal hunting in the park. The mass was certainly large enough, and I could make out dark fur catching the early morning light. But as I approached, each step becoming heavier than the last, the shape before me refused to resolve into anything familiar. My mind struggled to categorize what I was seeing. The form lay sprawled in an unnatural position, and I noticed something that stopped me cold. A broad, distinctly hand-like appendage, fingers splayed against the ground. The hair covering the form wasn't the coarse brown of a moose, but a dense, dark fur that reminded me more of a primate. My gaze travelled up the massive body, taking in the proportions that seemed impossibly human-like, yet far too large. The broad chest wasn't moving. The shock hit me like a physical blow. My camera hung, heavy at my side, but I couldn't bring myself to raise it. Every instinct screamed that I needed to document this, to capture evidence of whatever this was. But fear and disbelief paralyzed me. Without conscious thought, I found myself backing away, my boots sliding on loose scree as I retreated down the slope. I didn't stop until I was well away from the site, my heart pounding and hands shaking. For the first time in my career, I had failed to follow proper protocol and document a significant discovery. But in that moment, documentation was the furthest thing from my mind. Back at camp, my hands still trembling, I pulled out my field notebook. The pages seemed to mock the inadequacy of standard report language. After several false starts, I managed only a brief entry. 2347 hours. Investigated source of seismic disturbance. Located deceased specimen body on eastern slope. Unable to classify species. No photos taken. The words felt hollow, failing to capture the enormity of what I'd witnessed. I sat in my tent, the thin fabric offering little comfort as my mind wrestled with rationalization. It must have been a bear, I told myself. Maybe diseased or deformed, viewed in bad light and through the lens of exhaustion. But those hands, no bear had hands like that. And the proportions were all wrong. The chest too broad, the limbs too long and articulated. Every snap of a twig or rustle of branches sent my heart racing. The normal nighttime sounds of the wilderness, so familiar after 15 years of service, suddenly seemed sinister and loaded with meaning. Was that just wind in the trees, or something moving? Did that shadow outside my tent belong to swaying branches or something else? Sleep was impossible. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, straining to hear through the darkness. The musky scent from earlier seemed to linger in my nostrils, though I couldn't be sure if it was real or memory. My flashlight stayed clutched in one hand, my 357 in the other, though I doubted either would make much difference if what? I couldn't even complete the thought. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every time I started to drift off, my mind would replay the scene in the clearing. The massive forms sprawled across broken vegetation, that thick reddish-brown fur, those unnervingly human-like hands. Each replay seemed to add new details, though I couldn't trust my memory anymore. Was the fur really that colour? Had the hands actually been that large? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became of anything except the bone-deep wrongness of what I'd encountered. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when I reached the ranger station. My supervisor was already there, reviewing paperwork at his desk. I must have looked worse than I thought because he immediately set down his coffee and gestured for me to sit. "Thomas, you look like hell. What happened out there?" I kept my voice, steady, professional. "Sir, I need a team to go back in. Found something that requires immediate verification." I pulled out my field notebook, showing him the sparse entry about the body. "I'd like to request backup, preferably law enforcement presence." He studied the entry, his expression shifting from concern to skepticism. "A body with primate characteristics? Arnett, you're one of my most reliable rangers. What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm reporting what I observed. We need to document this properly, and I don't want to go back alone." After some discussion, he agreed to call the sheriff's department. Within 2 hours, Deputy Matthews arrived, his cruiser kicking up dust in the parking lot. The deputy was a stocky man with 20 years of experience, handling everything from lost hikers to poaching cases. He listened to my account with professional detachment, only raising an eyebrow at certain details. "No photos?" he asked, checking his service weapon. "No, sir. I know that was a procedural failure on my part." "Well, let's go see what you found," he said, though his tone suggested he expected a wasted trip. We took 2 vehicles up to the trailhead, the deputy's cruiser barely managing the rough access road. The hike in was tense, with my supervisor occasionally checking his watch and the deputy scanning the tree line. I led them along my original route, past the clearing with the woven structures, which drew long looks from both men, and toward the ridge where I'd made my discovery, my Heart pounded harder with each step. Either I was about to be vindicated or I'd just destroyed my professional credibility. The weight of their skepticism pressed against my back as we approached the slope littered with broken alder. I took a deep breath and began recounting the previous day's discovery, my voice steady despite the churning in my gut. As I spoke, Deputy Matthews continued his methodical sweep of the area, his boots crushing the flattened vegetation where the body had lain. The stench hit us then, a putrid, eye-watering odour that hadn't dissipated with the missing corpse. It was stronger than yesterday, making my eyes water and catching in the back of my throat. The supervisor pulled his collar over his nose while Matthews stepped back, blinking rapidly. Something definitely died here, Matthews conceded, his voice muffled. But look at these drag marks heading into the timber. Classic bear behaviour. They'll move a carcass to feed in cover. I followed the deep furrows in the earth with my flashlight, noting how they disappeared into the dense undergrowth. But something wasn't right. The spacing was too regular, too purposeful for a bear's chaotic feeding. "Deputy," I called out, my light catching something in the mud near the drag marks. "Take a look at this." Matthews crouched beside me, his camera ready. There, pressed clearly in the soft earth, was an impression that made my skin crawl. 5 distinct fingers and a broad palm, larger than any human hand I'd ever seen. The mud had preserved it perfectly, showing even the subtle ridges where knuckles would be. "That's no bear print," I said quietly. Matthews straightened up, his expression hardening. "Listen, Ranger Arnett, I know what you think you saw yesterday, but we can't start rumours about some kind of creature out here. This is bear country, always has been. They're strong enough to move a moose carcass, and they're smart enough to hide their kills." He snapped a few photos of the handprint, but I could tell by his posture he'd already dismissed it. The supervisor stood back, watching our exchange with careful neutrality, but I saw him make a note in his own book. The deputy turned to address us both. "My official report will list this as probable bear activity. I strongly suggest we leave it at that. The last thing this park needs is monster stories bringing in thrill seekers and conspiracy theorists." The next few days blurred together as I tried to maintain my normal patrol routine. But nothing felt normal anymore. Every sound in the wilderness took on new meaning. Every shadow demanded closer inspection. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that the incident had just rattled me more than I wanted to admit. On Tuesday morning, I was checking trail conditions near Wolverine Creek when I heard it. The distinct snap of branches off to my left, maybe 50 yards through the brush. I stopped, listening intently. Another snap, this time slightly closer. Whatever was moving through the trees was keeping pace with me, paralleling my path. I reached for my radio, then stopped myself. What would I even say? That I was being followed by something I couldn't see. I'd already submitted my report about the body and the structures, carefully worded to stick to observable facts. The response had been predictably dismissive. A memo suggesting I might want to take some leave, get some rest. "Field stress is common," they'd written, especially in isolated posts. The breaking point came Thursday afternoon. I was using my binoculars to survey the upper ridgeline for erosion damage when a massive dark figure appeared at the crest. Even at that distance, I could make out the broad shoulders, the way it moved with deliberate purpose across the skyline. My hands shook as I tried to focus the binoculars, but in those few seconds of fumbling, the figure disappeared behind the ridge. I radioed in a wildlife sighting report, carefully avoiding any specific descriptions that might raise flags. The dispatcher's response was almost bored. "Probably a bear, Ranger Arnett. Make sure you're carrying your bear spray. But bears don't shadow you for days. Bears don't peek over ridgelines to check your position. And bears certainly don't leave you with the bone-deep certainty that you're being watched, studied, assessed." Every time I wrote up my daily logs, I found myself self-censoring, knowing that anything too specific would be attributed to an overactive imagination or workplace stress. The days following our return to that site weighed heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched during my regular patrols. Every snapping twig in the distance made me pause mid-stride, and the occasional sound of branches breaking parallel to my path sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, bears, moose, or even wolves. But deep down, I knew better. One afternoon, I spotted what looked like a massive dark figure cresting the ridge about half a mile ahead. I fumbled with my binoculars, hands trembling slightly as I raised them to my eyes. By the time I focused the lenses, whatever it was had disappeared. The rational part of my mind suggested it could have been a shadow cast by the clouds. But shadows don't move with such purpose. I filed detailed reports about these incidents, carefully documenting times, locations, and weather conditions. Each one came back with dismissive notes from my supervisors. Consider stress-related factors, one read. Another suggested I take some time off to reset. They thought I was letting my imagination run wild, but they hadn't seen what I had seen. This morning, I pulled up to the Granite Creek trailhead in my Forest Service truck, ready for another day of patrol. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern ridges, casting long shadows across the empty parking area. That's when I saw it, a neat stack of rocks balanced on my truck's hood, right in the center. These weren't just random stones thrown there by vandals. They were carefully selected and positioned, each one perfectly balanced on top of the other, forming a deliberate tower about 8 inches high. The precision spoke of intelligence, of purpose. My hands shook as I photographed the stack with my department-issued camera. I stood there for several long minutes, scanning the tree line, listening intently. The morning birds had gone quiet. That familiar, heavy silence pressed in around me. Whatever had left this message knew my schedule, knew which vehicle I drove, knew where I would be. This wasn't a random encounter. This was communication. Without touching the stones, I got back in my truck and drove out of there, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The message was clear. I wasn't the observer anymore. I was the observed. I noticed the change in how my colleagues looked at me first. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when I entered the ranger station, the awkward silences during radio checks. 15 years of respected service, and now I was that ranger, the one who'd lost his edge. The official report came down from headquarters last week. Seismic activity consistent with subsurface shifts in the permafrost layer. Clean, scientific, safe. They'd even attached a geological survey backing up their conclusion, but that didn't explain what I'd touched with my own hands, what I'd smelled that day on the slope. During the morning briefings, I caught the seasonal rangers exchanging, knowing looks whenever I spoke. One afternoon, I overheard 2 of them behind the equipment shed, their voices carrying more than they realized. "Arnett swears he found some kind of body up there," one whispered. "Says it was huge, covered in hair, but conveniently forgot his camera that day. I heard he actually touched it," the other replied with a snicker. "Must have been some bear. They weren't entirely wrong. I had touched it. The memory of that coarse hair, the broad palm larger than my own, the unmistakably primate features, it all haunted me. But I couldn't blame them for their skepticism. I'd been just as dismissive of similar stories before that day. The campfire stories grew more elaborate with each telling. By the end of the month, according to trail crew gossip, I'd encountered everything from a crashed alien to a prehistoric ice mummy. Each wild speculation chipped away at what little credibility I had left. My confidence, once as solid as the mountains themselves, began to crack. I second-guessed every unusual sound, every shadow movement in my peripheral vision. Worst of all, I started questioning my own memory of that day. Had the shock and isolation played tricks on my mind? Was I becoming the paranoid veteran everyone now whispered about? But then I'd remember the weight of those stone cans on my truck hood, placed there with undeniable purpose. And I knew whatever was out there understood exactly what it was doing to me. Sleep became my enemy in the weeks that followed. Each night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling of my cabin while my mind replayed every detail of that encounter. The worst part wasn't the fear or the doubt. It was the certainty. The memory of that hide beneath my fingers haunted me with its reality. Coarse, dense fur that felt almost warm to the touch, even in death. No bear, no moose. Something else, entirely. After 3 weeks of fragmented rest and growing dread, I sat down at my desk and began filling out transfer paperwork. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote, making my usually precise handwriting irregular. Request for immediate transfer. Personal reasons, read the header. I left it vague. Who would believe the real reason? The truth remained locked inside me, a weight I couldn't share. How could I explain to anyone the exact texture of what I'd touched? The way the hair had been different from any known wildlife, how the skin beneath had felt almost human-like in its elasticity. The proportions that defied classification. No report could capture the visceral reality of that moment, the way it had rewritten everything I thought I knew about these mountains. Considered trying to tell my supervisor the whole story as I handed in the transfer request, but the words died in my throat. The memory was mine alone now, too real to be dismissed, too fantastic to be believed. Instead, I mumbled something about needing a change of scenery, about the stress of isolated patrols. That night, as I packed up my cabin, my fingers brushed against my field notebook. I pulled it out, flipping to that day's entry. The words were sparse, clinical. Located large biological mass, species unknown, site contaminated by weather scavengers. Nothing about the texture that still lingered on my fingertips, nothing about the way it had changed me forever. Some truths, I realized, were better left unwritten. From the Private Journal of Thomas Arnett, dated September 15th, 2008, a decade has passed since that autumn in the Wrangell Valleys, but the memories haven't faded like I hoped they would. I'm writing this down now, not for any official record, God knows I filed enough of those, but as a warning to anyone who might find themselves in those remote corners of Alaska. The transfer papers were easy enough to file. Administration probably thought I was burning out, maybe suffering from isolation or stress. It's what they write in their reports when they can't explain something. I let them believe it, better than admitting I couldn't sleep without seeing that massive form sprawled in the undergrowth, or feeling the coarse, warm fur beneath my trembling fingers. The seismologists came up with their explanations for the booms, tectonic shifts, they said, ice movements in the glaciers, all neat scientific answers that fit into their worldview. The sheriff's deputy, who accompanied me back to the site, still jokes about Arnett's bear at department gatherings. I stopped attending those years ago. But here's what I need to say. What I wish someone had told me. If you're ever in those valleys, and the world goes quiet after one of those thunderous booms, the kind that shake the ground beneath your boots, don't investigate. Don't do what I did. Retreat. The silence isn't natural. It's a warning that something ancient is stirring in those mountains. The official reports tell one story. My memories tell another. The truth. Maybe it lies somewhere in between, or maybe it's something we're not ready to accept. I've spent 10 years trying to reconcile what I saw with what I know should be possible. The stack of stones on my truck hood that day told me one thing clearly. Whatever walks those valleys is intelligent enough to send a message. I don't expect anyone to believe me. That's not why I'm writing this. But if you're out there and the silence falls, if you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, remember my words. Some mysteries in this world are better left unexplored. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.